other news now, and youth crime in the New England Northwest has continued to make headlines with a push from the state opposition to toughen bail laws for repeat bail offenders. One of the worst affected communities is Moree, which is where three 14-year-olds allegedly stole a car last month and later collided with Narrabri man Daniel McNamara in Gunnedah, who was on his motorbike. He died soon afterwards. The teenagers didn't stop and were eventually arrested east of Gunnedah. Earlier this week, I spoke to Moree-based member for Northern Tablelands, Brendan Moylan, who agrees there is something seriously wrong in northwest New South Wales. Mr. Moylan, we know to say that the New England Northwest has been dealing with a crime wave is an understatement. In some cases, it's been more like a tsunami. And I guess one of the worst things about this is that the worst of the worst has happened. We've had a person being killed that we spoke about for last couple of weeks. Daniel McNamara from Narrabri being killed in Gunnedah by a allegedly stolen car driven by three 14-year-olds in Moree. When a person dies, we know that, okay, this should have been stopped a long, long time ago, and now we have the worst consequences possible. And we are still dealing with that tragedy of that death because we knew how shocking and how, in many ways, how disgusting the actions of those alleged teenagers were in the hours before the crash, but also afterwards, especially as police have said they didn't render assistance to Daniel. They continued to drive off. There is something seriously wrong, isn't there, in our region when it comes to youth crime?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the poor McNamara family have been through hell. That's a phone call that no father, brother should ever have to take. What happened? I mean, obviously that matters before the courts, so we have to be careful with what we say. But that you're right. Disgusting is probably one word, and quite a correct word to use to describe that incident. I think initially, Daniel, my initial feeling was one of, shock and disbelief, and then it sort of gives way to a feeling of anger that it's gotten this far. When you look at what's going on, particularly in my hometown of Moree, but not just Moree, and Tamworth as well, and Inverell, Armidale, Kempsey, Grafton, right across regional New South Wales, it's pretty clear that there's something terribly wrong. And look, the Parliament has a number of jobs here. Number one, the Parliament has to look to legislate to ensure that regional communities are protected, and then the Parliament also has to look at the underlying issues of crime. And a lot of taxpayers' money is spent every year in communities in the New England Northwest to address the underlying issues of youth crime. And I think as a community and as taxpayers, we need to know whether that money is being spent well and what return taxpayers are getting. I think there needs to be more accountability for the money that is being spent in this space. And the question also has to be asked, are we targeting the right age group? Should we be targeting kids of a younger age group? Because certainly what I'm hearing when I talk to police, when I talk to teachers, youth workers, is that those programs that are funded by the state government perhaps need to be targeting younger children, 10, 11, 12, not children who are 14, 15, 16. So I think there's two roles for Parliament to play in that space. And then the third space is obviously to do whatever it can in terms of police resources, which is a big one as well.
And I was looking at the ideas, as you mentioned a couple of weeks ago, regarding trying to target younger people, maybe even younger than under 10 and all that. And for me, the biggest question is, when is the best at a younger age to reach out to the kids? Because, as you know, I've been interested to see about that cognitive development among kids and what they witness, what they understand, how they would learn from their surroundings, from family, from relatives, from other adults. And I think one of the biggest aspects too is to reach out in a way that does connect with them, but is also an effective way that makes it that this will have not just that short-term improvement or implications, but that long-term implications. Because I know some of these kids, they follow like their older siblings or other relatives because they think it's cool or that's the only life they know. So that's something that I would like to see the state government and the state opposition be able to really work on. Can you see where I'm coming with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, you're 100% right from what I'm hearing across certainly my electorate, that quite often these young people who are committing these crimes are coming from a background where crime is the norm, and waking up in the morning and having a family unit and having a family figure that you can look up to is not the norm. And so there has to be accountability. I think the starting place needs to be is that the government has to look at and ask some pretty difficult questions. Say, right, what are we funding? What's this money achieving, and what sort of results are we getting? And then the next step is to say what could be done better. And I think that comes into that area that you're talking about there, Daniel, and looking at particularly these younger kids, because I'm really concerned that all of this money that we're spending at the moment is perhaps going to children, and they are children who are not going to be able to be helped by these programs purely because of their age. So, yeah, look, there's a lot of work to be done. It's such a difficult space, and look, the Premier, when he was in Moree a few weeks ago, he said something that sort of resonated with me, and I agree with the Premier on this. He said that if there was a simple fix, it would have been done years ago. And he's right. This is a incredibly complicated space. My view is that the first step of Parliament has to look at is legislative change to make sure the community is protected. And then the next step is some accountability in this funding and working out whether we're getting bang for buck in terms of the funding.
And you have just mentioned the push to change the bail laws. We have this petition that has reached over 20,000 signatures, and that will be presented to state parliament. We know that yourself and your fellow Nationals, MLA Kevin Anderson, are backing this. And we also know that the state government is flagging the tougher bail laws at the moment. Looking at what the Premier Chris Minns is currently proposing, are you satisfied with what the state government is proposing, or do you think that there needs to be more done?
I certainly think more could be done. I mean, firstly, in relation to the Bail Act, the particular section that you're referring to is Section 22C. And the intention of the Parliament there was that in circumstances where a young person who is on bail for a serious offence, so that could be break and enter, motor vehicle theft, etc., if that young person is then released on bail and commits another serious offence, such as another break and enter or another motor vehicle theft, then bail should not be granted unless the court has a higher degree of certainty that the young person won't reoffend. So I don't think many people in the community would argue that someone who is already on bail for breaking into a house and then breaks into another house whilst on bail, I don't think many of the people in the community would expect that young person to get bail again. And certainly the victims of those B&Es wouldn't expect that. So I think credit where credit's due, that section is a good section. It has come under criticism both from the courts and from some sections of the Parliament. But the extension of 22C, personally, is welcome. I would like to see the loophole in Section 22C closed off so that courts simply cannot grant bail, whether they have a high degree of certainty or not, because we saw, and again, we need to be careful about what we say about the Gunnedah incident, but we saw what happens there in circumstances where the court exercises discretion. And so I think ultimately 22C, if it could be amended to remove that discretion so that it's simple, so that if a young person breaks into a house and he's granted bail, he's given an opportunity and then breaks into another house, there shouldn't be bail in those circumstances. So I think 22C is a good starting point. I think we also need to look at the Crime Sentencing Procedure Act. I think the importance of victims in the sentencing synthesis, as it's known by judges, needs to be elevated. Getting a little bit technical, but putting my solicitor's hat on, I would like to see that the aggravating factors only need to be proven on the balance of probabilities, which is the same for the mitigating factors. Currently, the court has to find the aggravating factors proven beyond reasonable doubt, which limits the court's ability to make findings of aggravation, which would lengthen the sentence. And then similarly, I think the court also needs to look at Dolly Incapax. Dolly Incapax is a very old legal principle. It goes back, 400-500 years, but in circumstances where you have a young person who might be 13, covering their face, arming themselves, breaking into a house, being caught by the police and then charged, and then having no action taken because the young person is not 14 or over, and so it's assumed that the young person doesn't know what he or she is doing is wrong. Again, I just think that's not keeping up to date with Australia in 2025, and I think the Parliament should be looking at that legal principle as well.
As you have just mentioned about keeping repeat bail offenders in custody, that of course means that they're taken off the streets, and that can prevent them from committing further actions or be involved in any further actions. The question that I just want to put to you is, because of that, do you believe that New South Wales has the custody capacity at the moment to possibly have more of these juvenile offenders in detention, awaiting their other court dates or anything like that? Because one issue I am very aware of currently going on in the Northern Territory is, while the Country Liberal Party has been doing this tough on crime bent since they were elected, with so many more people being arrested, their jails are so full that they've actually had to put people into watch houses, and they're facing a massive capacity issue. Are you happy with, or are you aware of what the current capacity is? Because the last thing we know that can also lead to more controversy is kids being put into police watchtowers or jail cells for sometimes long periods.
Yeah. So Section 22C only captures a very small number of offenders. It only captures, those serious repeat offenders, the worst of the worst. And so 22C is not a situation that is going to see hundreds and hundreds of children refused bail and locked up. I think the statistics during the trial of the last 12 months was that section only captured approximately 80, I think, offenders in a 12-month period. And so it is a measure that the government have brought in that I support, which targets the worst of the worst. And so Section 22C should not, Daniel, lead to overcrowding, because it only targets a very small number of young offenders who are the worst of the worst.
That's good to know. Thank you very much for that, Mr. Moylan. You were, of course, up on Saturday. There were over 500 people gathering in Moree at Jellicoe Park, demanding an end to the crime situation. That's a significant minority of the Moree population saying enough is enough, and we know how bad the situation is up in that town, with so many break-ins or police pursuits that having to be conducted, which of course brings a lot of risk, not just to the police themselves, but to anyone that they're potentially chasing, or any civilians that might be caught up with that. How was that meeting? What was the mood at that time?
It was pretty somber, to be honest. So, look, there was roughly, I think, 500 people there from the community. There were a number of victims of crime that spoke. A number of local Indigenous elders spoke. The brothers and dad of Mr. McNamara, who was killed at Gunnedah, they were also there and spoke. So it was a pretty somber mood. And I think it's on a Saturday morning where people have commitments, people have kids' sport, people have their shopping, people have work as well. The fact that 500 members of the community came together and listened and discussed this issue peacefully is a pretty good indication that the community, really wants a change. And like me, a lot of people in our community, particularly at Moree, are really getting frustrated with this is what we're now known for. Moree is now known as a crime capital, and we have such a good town here. We contribute so much to the Australian economy. We're the wealthiest agricultural shire in all of our country. We have great people. We have good facilities, and it is a great community. But unfortunately, because of a few bad eggs, we now have that reputation. So it was a somber mood and pretty strong desire for something to change as well.
And we know, given the fact that there is this push to get more people out into regional areas, but there's a lot of investment going on in Moree, ranging from renewables to the activation precincts, the inland rail, the tourism aspect as well. And many people are put off by coming to a place like Moree because they're in fear of being mugged or attacked or their house broken in. And we know, of course, one of the biggest issues is trying to get those critical welfare and doctors and all those specialists that are vital, that could really help the community of Moree, not just with the people themselves, but also those school kids, like those teachers, those social workers, those counsellors, those psychologists, and as well as those police officers who might be more reluctant to come up to a place like Moree, but we know that if they do come up, they could make a real big difference.
Yeah, you're right. It is really frustrating, and it's making that reputation is making it difficult for private businesses to recruit. It's making it difficult for public organisations to recruit. For example, we had one of our doctors at the Aboriginal Medical Centre. He was broken into and assaulted. And so it makes it very difficult to attract those professional staff. So, look, it is a problem. Crime has been a problem, since Adam was a boy. That's the reality of it. And we will never stop crime. But what we have seen over, I think, the last 12 months, particularly in my hometown of Moree, is we've seen a spike. And the community is sending a really strong message to the parliament that we need to change.
And without resorting to stereotypes, we know many of these crimes are being committed by those of Indigenous background, and that in itself often reveals the situation about what these kids' upbringing is being like. We've of course spoken about that these places that they're living in might not be the most advantageous. They might be witnessing domestic abuse, poverty. They're or witnessing their family or friends doing the same thing, so they don't know any better. Looking at that, is there a different way that could be approached for Indigenous kids, or should it be a more wider scope for kids of all that ages? Because we know that in many ways there's always a different approach when it comes to Indigenous Australians and trying to combat the crime, but also break the cycle and improve life expectancy, the standard of living, and all that.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, my personal view is that the intervention programs that are operating aren't targeting kids young enough, and that's Indigenous, non-Indigenous across the board. I just think that we need to have a real look at what those programs are setting out to achieve and what they are actually achieving, because without that sort of base data, we're not going to know whether they're delivering outcomes or not. So I don't think it's a question of whether we need to have different approaches for Indigenous or non-Indigenous kids. I just think we need to look at working with kids who are younger.
And so what are you hoping to see over the next couple of months? We know this petition's going to be presented to State Parliament. The government is doing these tougher bail laws. What do you want to see, or what do you think could be done?
Well, the petition that was started by Phoebe in Tamworth, that has now reached 20,000 signatures. So that will now be required to be debated on the floor in Parliament. And so I'm hopeful that will happen either in March or April. Kevin Anderson, the member for Tamworth, will formally present that petition. And what that does, Daniel, is that it essentially brings this issue to the fore, and the government will now be forced to debate it. In addition to that, I suspect that the government will be bringing in some form of reforms in either the March or April sittings themselves. My approach to this issue is to work with the government as much as possible, because the reality is the government has the numbers, and getting legislation from a bill into an act requires the numbers of Parliament. And so I've been doing whatever I can to, work with the government and provide them with as much information about what's happening on the ground in our patch as possible. And so I'm quietly confident that there will be some amendments to be brought forward by the government in the legislative space. But I would also really love to see a targeted approach to get some accountability with all of this funding. I think that's the next step that we need to look at. And that's a difficult conversation, but I think the Parliament should have it.
We'll certainly keep an eye out when Parliament resumes. Brendan Moylan, thank you so much for your time.
No worries. Thanks, Daniel.